1 Kings chapter 11. This is another one of those in a long line of chapters that are like this that you just wish wasn't there. We have seen now Solomon's reign over the last several chapters, and to this point, it has been wonderful. God has blessed. He has been one of the most impressive individuals who has ever lived, honestly. It would be great if chapter 10 was the last word we had on Solomon. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And so here we are, 1 Kings chapter 11. It says, "But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and the Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, You shall not go in unto them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn your heart away after other gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord. And likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrificed under their gods. And the Lord was angry with Solomon, because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he kept not that which the Lord commanded. Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, For his mother thy father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of thy son. Howbeit I will not rend away all the kingdom, but will give one tribute to thy son for David my servant's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, which I have chosen. And the Lord stirred up an adversary unto Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the king's seed in Edom. For it came to pass, when David was in Edom, and Joab the captain of the host was gone up to bury the slain, after he had smitten every male of Edom. For 6 months did Joab remain there with all Israel, until he had cut off every male in Edom. That Hadad fled, he and certain Edomites of his father's servants with him, to go into Egypt, Hadad being yet a little child. And they arose out of Midian, and they came to Paran, and they took men with them out of Paran, and they came to Egypt, unto Pharaoh the king of Egypt, which gave him house, and appointed him victuals, and gave him land. And Hadad found great favor in the sight of Pharaoh, so that he gave him to wife the sister of his own wife, the sister of Taphanes the queen. And the sister of Taphanes, and that Joab the captain of his host was dead, Hadad said to Pharaoh, Let me depart, that I may go to mine own country. Then Pharaoh said unto him, But what hast thou lacked with me, that, behold, thou seekest to go to thine own country? And he answered, Nothing, howbeit let me go in any wise. And God stirred him up another adversary, Rezon, the son of Eliadab, and they reigned in Damascus. And he was an adversary to Israel all the days of Solomon, beside the mischief that Hadad did. And he abhorred Israel and reigned over Syria. And Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephrathite of Zereda, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow woman, even he lifted up his hand against the kiss. He made him ruler over all the charge of the house of Joseph. And it came to pass that at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him in the way, and he had clad himself with a new garment, and they two were alone in the field. And Ahijah caught the new garment that was on him, and rent it in 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, Take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to thee. But he shall have 1 tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. Because that they have forsaken me, and have worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the children of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways, to do that which is right in my own eyes, and to keep my statutes and my judgments, as did David his father. Howbeit I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him prince all the days of his life for David my servant's sake, whom I chose, because he kept my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and will give it to thee, even 10 tribes. And unto his son will I give 1 tribe, that David my servant may have a light always before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen me to put my name there. And I will take thee, and shall reign, and thou shalt reign according to all thy soul desireth, and shalt be king over all Israel. And it shall be, if thou wilt hearken unto all that I command thee, and wilt walk in my ways, and do that what is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, that I will be with thee, and I will build thee a sure house, as I built for David, and I will give Israel unto thee. And I will be for this, for this afflict the seed of David, but not forever. And Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam. And Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, unto Shishak king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. And the rest of the acts of Solomon, and all that he did in his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And at the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and was essentially fully concerned with showing us how great Solomon was, how rich he was, how amazing the kingdom was, how happy the people were. Remember, that was one of the things that the queen commented on. The people are happy, right? The half has not been told of how wonderful you and Israel are. And so chapter 10 was full of women. And this is no coincidence, I believe, that this was the downfall of Solomon. I think this is another outworking of David's sin. David obviously had an issue with women. We talked about that when we covered David. And this same issue with women, Solomon obviously saw that. I feel the influence of David. He also has an issue when it comes to women. And so God had given the Israelites a very clear command, which was not to intermarry with the Canaanite people. In Deuteronomy 7, it says, "For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you and destroy thee suddenly." Now, it needs to be said that the command was not, don't marry anybody with a different skin color. There are people who take this and they run with it and make it something it was not. That was not the command. The command was specifically, don't marry the Canaanites. That was the command. Why? Because they're pagans. And when you start intermarrying with pagans, what is going to happen is exactly what happens to Solomon. There's going to be syncretism, which is syncretism is where you're going to try and hold on to me, but while trying and holding on to me, you're going to try and worship their gods too, right? You're going to syncretize their religion with yours, and it's going to become an abomination. They're going to turn your hearts from me. That's exactly what God commanded. That's exactly what God said would happen. That's exactly what happened with Solomon. And then furthermore, in addition to the general command which was given to all of Israel, don't marry the Canaanites, God specifically commanded kings not to multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away, in Deuteronomy 17. That was a specific command to kings. Why would that specific command be given to kings? Because they would have the means to multiply wives unto themselves. And Solomon most certainly did. And so he broke both of these commands. And so, like I said, Solomon ends up following in David's footsteps here, where sinful relationships with women become his greatest source of trouble. And that's exactly what happens. And so Solomon, it says, clave to these in love. And we see the outstanding numbers here. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. Now, essentially a concubine was kind of a secondary wife. They were still a wife, but they weren't seen as kind of your main wife. And what is more than likely here, and 1,000 wives, it seems incomprehensible to us. But there's two things at play here. Number one, it was not uncommon for Near Eastern kings, ancient Eastern kings like this, to have incredibly large harems. Okay, that was almost the norm. That was just kind of how things were done. Not excusing it, but just that's historical accuracy. But then secondly, it is highly likely, now we're not told this, but it is along those lines. It's very difficult for somebody to go to war with a nation if your daughter is the queen, right? And so that was a political thing. Now, that doesn't mean that Solomon was uninvolved. The text specifically tells us that he clave unto these in love, right? So whatever the reason behind the number, Solomon was giving his heart to these women, which is clear because they draw his heart away from God. And so, even if these were political alliances, it does not change the fact that this was breaking God's command, that this was sin, and doesn't change the devastating consequences that came from breaking God's command. And so there's a lot of things at play here. Now, I think I'm comfortable in saying most people agree, I being one of them, that this Solomon started doing, getting all these wives probably fairly early on. But it wasn't until he was older and later on in his reign that really they began to draw his heart away from God. And so I think probably for the majority of Solomon's reign that he was very dedicated, that he was following God. Not to say that this wasn't sin, but that he was still trying to follow God. And it was later on in his reign as he's with peace. They had given Solomon and Israel a great amount of peace that was necessary for the building of the temple, that was necessary for the strengthening and enlargement of Israel that we have talked about over the last several chapters. But Solomon, in that peace, begins to get very comfortable, and as he's comfortable, he begins to get more involved with these women, and these women turn his heart away from God. There's an old saying, and I think it fits very well with Solomon, and I'll see if I get this right. Bad times create strong men create good times create weak men create bad times. Right? And that's Solomon's life. He inherited a good, peaceful land. And over time, that turned Solomon weak. And Solomon's weakness turned the nation weak. Life. And so his heart, in fact, you see this over and over in the first several verses. His heart was no longer perfect with the Lord. Right? His heart was right, but it's no longer perfect as it was with David. His heart is not like David's. We see this over and over, these references to his heart. His heart was no longer perfect with the Lord his God, and soon he went after Ashtoreth. He went after Milcom. Milcom is kind of an abbreviated spelling for Molech. Molech is probably one that you've heard of. And he goes beyond this. He actually builds high places, and high places were not exactly temples, but they were places of worship. And so a high place, you see this term in the Old Testament a lot. Every now and then a godly king will come along and they will destroy the high places. Right? So a high place was an area where people would go worship false gods. Like I said, not necessarily a full temple, but it was a place kind of dedicated to a certain pagan god. And so he built these high places, and he built them for Chemosh. He built them for Molech. Now, I do want to point this out. The text never tells us specifically that Solomon was directly involved in the worship of these gods. And the reason why I point that out, and I'm not saying that he didn't. I'm just saying that the text doesn't tell us that he did. It never says that Solomon was involved in the worship of these gods, because the worship of these gods was some of the most God-forsaken, abominable acts you can think of. Sacrifice. And so with Molech, they would create these metal images of the god with outstretched hands. And they would heat those hands so that they were red hot, and they would place their infants upon the hands of that god so that they would kill their children in worship of Molech. It's sickening. It's no wonder why God destroyed the Canaanites. Right? When people talk about and get all upset about the fact that God commanded the Israelites to go in and wipe them out, it's because that's the kind of thing they were doing. And so, again, we're not told that Solomon was doing those kinds of things. He very well may have been. Even if, and I'll say this, even if you're responsible for those kinds of actions by allowing it under their gods. So we don't even know the total number of high places or various gods to whom Solomon built these high places. And so you can see here just what kind of a turn Solomon took. Right? And it wasn't as if this was a gradual. This was a sharp turns that Solomon were doing were worthy of anger and wrath and judgment. And so this is no surprise where verse 9 tells us the Lord was angry. And so it tells us specifically, God had appeared to him twice. Now remember, at the very beginning of his reign, when he asked, ask me anything and I'll give you what you want, he asked for wisdom, because his heart was turned, which had appeared unto him twice. And so essentially God is saying, I have blessed you more than most people could ever dream of being blessed, not only in the wisdom, not only in the riches, but I have come to you. I have spoken with you. 2 times have I done this. You have had privileges and blessings that go beyond what most, not just in his generation, most in the world who have ever existed could ever dream of. And yet, even above, or in spite of all that, you have allowed these women to turn your heart away from me. And so God had blessed him. God had blessed Israel through him. God's people at this particular point were prosperous. They were doing, quite well. We've talked about this spiritually, probably not as good as they were under David, but they were, fiscally were doing well. The nation was large and growing. All things were going well. And then Solomon starts to do this. And as his heart turns, he begins to build these high places. And then guess what happens to the nation? Their hearts turn. And so, like I've been mentioning, it's just a steep downhill fall from the time of Solomon till the time whenever eventually Israel and then eventually Judah are conquered. And so God would be sure to his word. And so what is interesting is that God had made several promises. God had made promises to David. God made promises to Solomon. And so here, God is short to his word. He told Solomon, if you worship me, I'll bless you. If you don't, judgment is coming. But he also gave certain promises to David. And so in his kindness to David's obedience, which I find fascinating, we see this a couple of times in this chapter, God would judge Solomon. He would judge the nation, but it wouldn't actually happen in Solomon's lifetime. It would happen while his son was reigning, and God was going to rend the kingdom away. And now, several times in this chapter, you see that he says he's going to rend the kingdom away, but he's going to give him one tribe. But then when we get to the prophecy of Ahijah, he specifically says he rends the piece into 12 pieces, and he gives Jeroboam 10, meaning that there's 2 left over. And so he gives Rehoboam Judah, but what we'll see as we go on is eventually the tribe of Benjamin and Judah, they come together and they form the southern nation of Judah. And so the 10 northern tribes are Israel, Benjamin, and Judah will be the nation of Judah in the south. We'll see that more next chapter, but that's just kind of how that plays out. And so he would allow the line of David to continue to reign over a portion of Israel. Why? Because God was faithful to his promises, and he promised these things to David. And so in spite of Solomon's great sin, he would allow this to continue. And so the rest of the chapter then is incredibly fascinating, because we're going to see 3 specific men who the text tells us that God raised up as adversaries. Now, why that's fascinating to me is because with at least the first 2 men, Hadad and Rezin, what we see is that God began to put into motion things that would cause these men to become adversaries to Solomon long before these sins of Solomon ever even began to happen. And so specifically, again, Hadad and Rezin, but what we see here is there's another instance where we see God's sovereignty, where we see God's omniscience, where he began to, again, he put things in motion so that these men would be causing certain events to take place that were eventually going to lead to judgments upon Solomon for things that had not even yet happened as far as we're concerned. And so, again, we see God knows the end from the beginning, and he causes things to take place that go far beyond our understanding. And so this is one of the things that I think we as Christians need to take away and understand, that we're not going to always get all the answers as to why things happen. God has control over this. God has an understanding that goes beyond anything we can comprehend. His ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And so if ever there were people questioning and wondering, why did these events happen with David in his lifetime? Well, one of the reasons we can know, because of the scriptures tell us, one of the reasons is so that they could eventually become a foil for Solomon, even though Solomon was not yet even born. But God knew this apostasy was going to happen. God knew this sin was going to take place. And God knew the judgment he was going to bring upon Solomon before David was even alive, right? He knows all of these things from before the foundation of the world. And so we see an interesting look at the way that God sovereignly moves over the affairs of men to bring to pass his will, right? And so that's one thing that I find so fascinating about this particular chapter. And so the first adversary we see here is a man named Hadad. And so we see in verse 14, the Lord stirred up an adversary unto Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the king's seed in Edom. And so to make a long story short, Hadad was of the royal court in the nation of Edom. And David, during his reign, had conquered the Edomites. 2 Samuel chapter 8. Again, before Solomon was born, 2 Samuel chapter 8, David conquers the Edomites. So we find out here that after he conquered them, he sends Joab in to kill all the males of Edom. And there were, obviously, if you wanted to remove a nation not only from being a problem for you, but to being a problem for your kids and your grandkids and nation in the future, that's the way to do it. You go in, you kill all the males, no more problem. And so that's what he has Joab do. He comes in, and for 6 months, I think is what it says. Yeah, verse 16, for 6 months, Joab is there making sure this takes place. However, Hadad and a few others were able to escape. And so we don't know how old he was, but Hadad and some of the others were able to escape. They make their way down to Egypt. Hadad is able to establish a family there and get a little bit of prominence. And then whenever he finally hears that David and Joab had died, he makes his way back to Edom, where he gets a certain level of control and power and influence. And I'm going to come back to him in just a second. So that was Hadad. And then the second adversary was this man Rezin. And so Syrians. This man fled the battle while that was taking place. Eventually, he was able to come back to Damascus, where he was an adversary to Israel all the days of Solomon. Now, all the days it means one of two things. Either it just means when he is older. I don't believe that, because it says all the days. And so what is likely is that he was a very small foil, almost an afterthought to Solomon during the beginning part of his reign. And then when he's older and these sins start taking place and his heart is turning away, the foil becomes stronger, right? And so he becomes more of an adversary. Now, again, with both of these guys, we're not told what it is they do. The text just tells us that he raises an adversary. And so we don't know what Hadad did. We don't know what Rezin did. However, what we do know, north. And what we saw in chapter 10 was that Solomon was very involved with imports and exports. He would import things from Egypt, and he would export these horses and chariots and things all over the area. And so if you have these two men who are adversarial to Solomon, and they control very key roads and things like that to the south and north of Israel, it doesn't take a genius to discern that they probably put a dent in Solomon's trade routes and his import business. And I think that's just one possibility. Obviously, we don't know what they did. The Bible doesn't tell us. There's probably other things. But that's obviously one very clear option. Internal adversary. The other two were external. The other two, again, events started being put into place before Solomon was even born. And then they came to pass as Solomon's sin began to take place. With Jeroboam, this was an internal threat. And the internal threat is always far more serious than the external threat. This is what we've seen and this bears out even just in the church. The church will always suffer more by things happening internally than by things happening externally. You can just read through the book of Acts. And what do you see? There were all kinds of persecution against the church. And what happened? Boy, they grew like wildfire. But when was the first person in the book of Acts in the church killed? The first person in the book of Acts that was killed was somebody in the church who lied, right? Ananias and Sapphira. And so the first real danger that the church felt was internal problems. And that's always been the case. And so here we have an internal adversary. And so Jeroboam was Solomon's servant. And it says that Solomon saw that he was very industrious. And that could probably cover a whole lot of things, but he was a man who could get things done. And Solomon's no fool. He wants men like that in important positions. And so he promotes this man and puts him over basically the whole tribe of Joseph. And so he began to oppose Solomon. He got mad because Solomon was doing some construction projects that he didn't agree with. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us why he doesn't like these. It doesn't tell us why he opposes these things being done. But for whatever reason, he doesn't care for this. And I saw some who, as I was studying this, I saw some who said that Jeroboam was mad because Solomon's enlargement of Jerusalem began to encroach upon the tribal territory of other tribes. I find that unlikely to be the source of his opposition, because even if it did begin to encroach, it probably would have been negligible, and more than likely, most people would have been okay with a strong capital, right? You want a strong capital. And so, again, maybe that is the case. I find that to be more unlikely. But nevertheless, he doesn't like this. This is probably something, I would imagine, that just, he kept serving. I agree with it, but I'm just going to put my head down and work until the prophet of God shows up. And so, Jeroboam, we see that he's leaving Jerusalem one day. We're not told, exactly where he's going. But he's leaving Jerusalem one day, and he encounters the man Ahijah. Now, we don't really know anything about Ahijah other than the fact that he's a prophet of God. And that's all we need to know. He's a prophet of God, and he's a true prophet, meaning the things that he actually says are from God and will come to pass. and he'll be in the story as we move on. But this man Ahijah just shows up, and he comes to Jeroboam, and he's wearing this nice new coat. We don't know exactly what it looked like, other than the Bible tells us it's new. And then he carries out an action that is very much like the prophets that we read of later on in the Old Testament. A very what is this guy doing? But he just starts cutting apart this coat, and he cuts it into 12 pieces. And then he tells Jeroboam to take 10 of them. And as he does that, he tells him, "For thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel," of opposition to Solomon. Whether or not he ever had aspirations of leadership beyond the position he was in, we're not told. But opposition. He disagreed vehemently with Solomon on a few things. And then here this guy shows up and says, you're going to be the king over 10 tribes of Israel. What exactly Jeroboam was thinking at this particular point, we don't know. All we know is that he was told this. And then he goes on to tell him, as Solomon had already been told, that this would take place during the reign of his son. Now, Solomon's an old man at this point, so Jeroboam has to know that can't be too long from now. And so during the reign of his son Rehoboam, God's going to tear the kingdom apart. He's given you 10 tribes. And so God then gives Jeroboam, interestingly enough, the same promise that he'd given to Saul, the same promise he gave to David, the same promise he gave to Solomon. If you will hearken unto me all that I command, I will give Israel to thee. And so it says, just be faithful. This is the same promise that God made with all the kings. Be faithful, and I will bless you. Be faithful. Not only will I bless you, I will bless Israel through you. Israel will be a great people. It will be a great nation. It will be a light to the Gentiles. All of these things. Just be faithful. Follow my commandments. Unfortunately, it was very rare that actually happened. And so should he have been faithful, it says that God said, he said, I will actually afflict the seed of David. He said, but not forever. Right? Not forever. I still have promises to uphold to David. And so essentially what he's promising him is a couple of things. Number one, you and your seed will be in control of the 10 tribes, which you would imagine the greater Israel. David and his seed, his posterity, will be in control of the only if you follow me, only if you are obedient. And what's interesting is when you get to the end of Israel's history, at least as far as the Old Testament is concerned, what you're going to find out is that Israel, the northern 10, never had a godly king, not once. They did not have a single godly king, and they were conquered over a century before. So, but that doesn't mean that God wouldn't have been faithful to his promise. He would have been, but there was simply never faithfulness to bless. There was never obedience to bless. And so we read then that Solomon, in verse 40, it says, Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam. Now, we don't know, again, there's a lot of unknown in this chapter. We don't know if that means that Jeroboam took this prophecy from Ahijah and then began to openly oppose Solomon, let it be known, hey, this is going to be my kingdom, or if Solomon just found out about this prophecy and flew off the handle and basically said, no, this ain't how it's going to be, and tried to kill Jeroboam. We don't know what led exactly to Solomon seeking to kill Jeroboam, but this is another example of Solomon's heart just being drawn away from God. This is not Solomon acting in wisdom. This is not Solomon acting in godliness. This is Solomon acting according to the flesh, according to base desires. This man represented something that he didn't like, and so he tried to eliminate it. Kind of sounds like David. Kind of sounds like the sin of David and Bathsheba with Uriah. And so again, we see that Solomon just, by this particular point, is just so far from God. He's not even, I think he's to the point now where not only is he not recognizing right from wrong, he simply doesn't even care about it anymore. Now, not that long ago, we studied through the book of Ecclesiastes. And I believe that Solomon is the author of that book. And you see that Solomon does fully acknowledge that he got to the point where he just didn't care about anything. It's all vanity, right? You see that over and over and over and over in that book. And you see that Solomon goes through all these kind of experiments. He kind of gives up on God. And I just want to see what the world has to offer. By the end of his life, I do believe far from the God who had so greatly blessed him all the way up until the very end. And so at the very end of the chapter then, it says the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? There are several books referred to in the Bible that we simply don't have anymore. The Acts of Solomon would have been something that the people knew about. That's why they wrote about it, but we don't have it anymore. We don't know what it says. We don't know. Obviously, it included probably more of the life of Solomon than we have, but it wasn't inspired scripture, so we no longer have it. And so it says, in the time of Solomon reigned in Jerusalem was 40 years. Solomon slept with his father, Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead. So after 40 years, Solomon has now died. The kingdom has turned over to Rehoboam, although end. And so when I'm just thinking, and by the way, let me just say this. I've said this several times over the last several chapters. Don't read chapter 11 into the first 10 chapters. Bless and praise Solomon for the good and curse him for the bad, right? Don't say that his entire reign was bad because of what we read in chapter 11. A lot of people try to do that. A lot of people try to read negativity into all the things that Solomon did, and the Bible doesn't do that. The Bible, sings his praises over and over and over again until it couldn't, right? Until the time came to change. And so when we think about the life of Solomon, as I was thinking about this week, and I just come to this conclusion, he becomes a great example to us of two things. He becomes a great example to us of the ability and the willingness of God to greatly bless faithfulness and obedience. Now, again, when I say that, obviously, I don't mean live obediently and God will bless you like he blessed Solomon. That's not what I mean, right? I don't mean to say that you're going to be rich and you're going to be the wisest and all these things, going to sing your praises. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that God is able and willing to bless faithfulness, but also, and obviously here in chapter 11, Solomon becomes an example to us of the absolute necessity to be steadfast in that faithfulness. Solomon was faithful up until a point where, because of sin in his life, his heart was drawn away from God. And of all the people who ever lived, Solomon is one of, if not the primary example of somebody who had it all because, specifically, and there's no question about this, because God was blessing them. And so my point being, if somebody like Solomon can take all of that and throw it away because of sin, how much more do you think it would be easy for us to take what we have and throw it away because of sin, even if we don't even realize we're doing it? And I don't think it was a single willful decision of Solomon that he just said, you know what, I'm tired of all this blessing of God. I'm just going to go start sinning with these women, and I'm going to be done with it. No, it's a lifetime of choices. It's a lifetime of simple little moments of disobedience that over time they turn our heart, right? A lot of influences and a lot of sinful decisions and a lot of little decisions that have been made over the course of time, and eventually you get to the point where you don't even recognize the person you are anymore because you're not following God. Well, that happened to Solomon, and what happened to Solomon is he stopped being steadfast in his faithfulness. Eventually, there was a point in time where a decision that should have been made against, let's just say against these women, wasn't made. And then that one decision led to another one. And then that one led to a few more. And eventually, those decisions built up, and Solomon's heart is no longer for God. And so we have to be steadfast in our faithfulness. And so let me close with these two quotes. Eugene Merrill said, one of the most puzzling aspects of the life of Solomon was the fact that he, the wisest of all men, could be so foolish, particularly in the last years of his reign. Now get this. This is so important. What must be understood is that the very basis, in fact, the essence of biblical wisdom is to fear God. It was precisely when Solomon neglected this principle that he began the slippery slope to folly. Again, go read the book of Proverbs. And over and over and over and over again, the injunction is to what? To fear God, because the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs at a time where he was doing just that. And then eventually he stopped fearing God as much as he should, and he started to love sin more than he loved God. Right? And so the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And then lastly here, Frederick Buechner, he said, King Solomon was among the wisest fools who ever wore a crown. And it's very unfortunate that that's kind of the lasting legacy of Solomon. And that's as it should be, I think. His life does stand as a warning for us. But it is unfortunate that for time immemorial, when somebody thinks of the name Solomon, what comes to mind normally isn't, hey, you remember when the Queen of Sheba visited and she said the half hasn't been told of the glory and majesty and wonder of Solomon and his kingdom? No, what usually comes to mind is Solomon, the guy had 1,000 wives and his heart turned away from God. That's his lasting testimony. And so it just goes to show us that an entire lifetime of faithfulness and obedience and being on fire for God, an entire lifetime, a lifetime of testimony can be thrown away because of a decision, because of a sin. And so we have to be on guard. Right? The New Testament consistently, Colossians 6 tells us exactly what we need to do with that adversary. We have to be prepared. And so, again, Solomon is a tremendous study for New Testament Christians, for not only what God can do, but also for what we need to be doing. And so I've really enjoyed taking a closer look at Solomon. It's one of those ones where I did wish we had a little bit more information about his reign, but we have what we need to have. And so now we begin to look at Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and the split of the nation and the eventual downfall that leads to their destruction. So let's pray, and we'll be dismissed.